Chapter 4 Patterns of Improvisation. Jason strode without the confidence that made a man be noticed by his peers. With eyes and skin dark as the night sky, he glanced around the ground to find his car keys resting neatly on the edge of the curb. He reached down to pick them up, but was distracted by how the crotch of his pants cradled his scrotum while doing so, and his fingers flexed with an involuntary twitch that knocked his keys from the curb just enough for them to plummet the couple inches to the street. He scoffed at his clumsiness and felt his face contort with embarrassment, although he was fully aware that no other person saw his folly. The idea that the reader might have seen his action did not bother him, but he did feel a sense of shame in thinking that the reader might have known the catalyst of his action. While thinking of penguins and candy canes, he leaned over further and, ignoring the fine grinding of fabric rubbing against his inner thighs, he grabbed his keys, pulling them out of the gutter and standing up. With a similar lack of grace in his movement, he looked closely at his keys to find the one for his car, and within a moment found himself sitting in the relative solitude of the driver's seat. He took a couple deep breaths to calm what felt like the start of anxiety, and then he started his car. A specific visceral reality overcame him as the vibration from the engine caused him to tremble slightly. Trying to stay focused, he put the car in gear quickly and started to drive. At 29, he thought that he would have already moved beyond the vulnerability he had towards all bodily and mental desires for and impressions of sex. But he was finding that even as his 30s loomed closer, he was in no way prepared for the kind of maturity he expected of himself. He turned on the radio and quickly flipped through the stations he had as his presets, changing to hear the songs ripe with innuendo being played on each station. He avoided each as they were already igniting his lust in ways that he enjoyed but felt ashamed of. He shut the radio off and drove in silence, save for his thoughts. His thinking was erratic, gambling about like a small woodland creature avoiding a bird of prey. As he drove, though, his thoughts began forming into an internal continuity, a conversation of sorts. But it was more than a conversation. It was recognition of his own self in progress. He spoke. If there is reason to know that the reader is above and or below, let it be that I see how it sees. And if there is no fault in being as I, let me ask for no other reason why. He thought about what he said, and aside from the trite phonetic fun of rhyming words, he decided there was actual meaning to his statement. He silently repeated the words and formulated that he did not need to feel bad about his own thoughts of a sexual nature, but only if he left those thoughts in the realm of being thoughts, not actualized in any way as they yearned to be. He resolved that he should feel bad if he did not make any efforts to bring them into reality, and that with all of his own will to being as he wanted to know himself to be, with honor, kindness, and dignity, he would find his way to break free of his shell and at least try to bring his desires from the mental realm into the physical. At that moment, he noticed something that he would have otherwise not noticed given the circumstance of the scope of his attention. His brain was in most instances so preoccupied with the constant barrage of layered thoughts crisscrossing to keep his attention limited to key points within his environment that he would not have had his optic sensory receptors detect the image of interest of which he suddenly became highly aware. He was driving north from the restaurant along Guadalupe Street and past the university campus as he saw a young girl sitting at the bus stop. He quickly glanced at the clock on his dashboard and realized that she would be waiting there for a bus that would not come. The bus schedule was not something he had memorized, but he did know that the buses that stopped at that particular stop did, at the time indicated on his dashboard clock, stop. And so he decided to stop. It was a matter of his choice to develop himself in a way that would express even a slight part of his own true self, as he knew himself to be in the world that perhaps could be witnessed by the reader, if such did exist. Notions of police presence began rearing up in his thoughts. And black men have suffered terribly at the hands of officers when daring to pick up a woman. His enculturation in a corrupted set of societal norms weighed on his mind. Before he could overthink it, he slowed his car and pulled to the curb, rolling down his passenger side window as he went. To his surprise, she did not lean away or seem apprehensive at all, and he would have become suspicious if not for the plain as day calm curiosity on her face. "You are going to be here a while," he said, immediately feeling he should elaborate to convey what he meant. "I mean, the bus you're waiting for isn't going to arrive, at least not until tomorrow. And I doubt you want to stay at this bus stop all night, although I am pretty sure you wouldn't stay there all night, but would wait for a long time and then get bored or frustrated and look at the schedule online. If you have a smartphone, or if you'd ask someone. And as I'm talking, I'm realizing that you might not be waiting for the bus, but just stopped here to take a rest from walking. So," he took a breath to collect his thoughts, and she just kept looking at him with a look somewhere between annoyed and amused. "I guess I'm saying, if you are waiting for the bus, that the bus has stopped running a few hours ago, so you'd be waiting until morning." He looked at her and felt his heart pounding with the ferocity of a galloping team of Clydesdales. She looked at him and slowly blinked. "Is that all you're saying?" she asked. He felt a warmth radiate in his chest and an embarrassment from having been so verbose. "Right now? Yes, that is all I am trying to say." They looked at each other without saying a word. He wondered why she was silent, and then wondered why he was silent, recalling thereafter that he was embarrassed by his wordiness a few moments earlier. He noticed her take a breath and cringed slightly at the prospect that she might tell him he was a creep for stopping, and that he was more and more creepy every second he remained there looking at her. But she was lovely. He couldn't avoid noticing. Her rounded cheeks and straight brown hair, with a tinge of red hanging just below her shoulders, were perfect complements to her round eyes. Her lips were not voluptuous, but with enough mass to convey sly suspicion while still appearing plump. Her hips and breasts were wide in how they expanded from the midline of her figure, and her legs, encased within the confines of blue denim, seemed neither longer or shorter, no thicker or thinner, than he would expect to see on a young lady such as herself. Taking notice of this in the nanoseconds between when she began and completed her inhalation made the moment of her speaking all the more laden with a maddening yet savory anticipation. "Well, if that is all you want to say, why didn't you drive off once you said it?" she asked. A second question from her. "I'd like to know you understood my babbling way of saying it." He was stunned to notice how clever his response sounded. She smiled at his expression of surprise at himself as much as the playful, self-effacing humor in his words. "Well, I do understand. The buses stopped running a couple of hours ago, and I've been sitting here like a fool for the last 20 minutes. She looked to her left and then her right. She looked back to Jason and found he was still looking at her. She returned his gaze for a moment. She smiled again and stood from the bus stop, approaching his car. He put his car in park and put on his flashers, explaining at such a low volume as he did so that she could barely distinguish his words. "I just want to securely stay and warn the other cars that I'm stopped here." She stood on the curb and bent down to peer into his car. "Since you are still here, I'm guessing you thought maybe by telling me this bit of important information that I did not previously know, I would be endeared to you, right?" "It is a good, honest way to start a conversation," he said, and immediately he experienced the shock he felt from his own conversational ability. She slightly laughed while looking at him. "Well, now that you've started it, I hope you like where it is about to go. I am headed to around Airport Boulevard to see a friend's band play at a bar. And since I now know that I would not get there by bus until tomorrow morning, the most obvious solution would be if you drove me up there, seeing as you are driving in that general direction." He thought about how he might be driving one more block and then turning west for all she knew, and wondered how she could assume that he was driving in the direction that he was going to drive anyway. But then he thought about how he should not needlessly place energy of his into thinking such things to extents that would cause him to pause in conversation for as long as that thought made him. He ceased biting his lower lip long enough to speak to her. "Sounds good. Hop in." He unlocked the door and she opened it, but hesitated a moment before stepping in. "You're not going to abduct me and leave me for dead after raping me, are you?" He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He felt his vocal cords squeeze out a touch of air as his mind raced with the possible responses to such a blunt question, none of which would reach the sufficient level of his not being offended by the question, coupled with an answer that would convince her he was not a person so devious that he would do such things as she wondered. Before he reached the next logical step in his thinking, she reached it for him. I'm kidding, geez, she said while stepping into the car and sitting, closing the door. I could take you out if you did try anything, though. So if you just keep moving with the same deliberate and slow motions as you have been, this should be fine. Nodding and looking ahead, he put the car into gear and began moving it forward while looking in the driver's side mirror to assure himself that he was clear. He turned off the hazard lights. Pondering just how clear he happened to be, he decided to try to be less socially awkward than a ride in silence would make him appear. So what is the band you are going to see? Oh, she sounded disinterested. A friend of a friend's band, Dylan's Revenge. They play covers of Bob Dylan's songs in different genres. Sounds interesting, he commented while not looking away from the road. Yeah, she kind of sighed. Then why do you sound disinterested? He said, still looking at the road. Because I don't go there for the music. I've heard them a bunch of times, and it is the same stuff to me. She paused, as though she wanted him to ask. But he didn't, so she continued as though he did. I go to meet people. But you've already met me tonight. He slowed to a stop due to a red light. Not really, she said, and he turned his head to look at her once the car was no longer moving. The confused look on his face prompted a giggle from her, and she said with only slight incredulity in her happy tone, "What is your name?" Realizing he had just driven a few blocks with a young lady in his car, one of his sanctuaries, without knowing her name, his face gave a jolting twinge of surprise. "Oh, I'm Jason." She smiled and was still for a moment before nodding slightly so he would continue. "And what is your name?" She held out her hand and he shook it. "Lindsay," she said, and was not at all bothered in any visible way by their holding each other's hands in the silence that did not at all seem uncomfortable to him. "Well, Jason," she finally said after what was longer than he thought would have made for a comfortable silence, but was not nearly as long a duration as he would have liked. She shifted her eyes forward with a slight grin. "Light's green." She looked back at him. Withdrawing his hand from the simple, intimate embrace, he returned his attention to driving the car. "Oh, thanks. And, I should probably be paying more attention to that." "Yeah, that might be good for the public safety," Lindsay said while looking forward. Clearing his throat as much to keep his focus in the conversation as to prepare his voice to be used, Jason made what he felt was a bold move in conversation. "Well, now that we have met officially, do you still want to go to that bar?" "I don't know if I want to stay there," she replied without missing a beat of his now fast thumping heart. But I should at least get there so I don't seem a flake to some folks. She caught herself mid-sentence with a thought that seemed too calculated to be anything other than earnest self-reflection. I would call friends, except they are not. He saw in his periphery as she looked at him before she continued to speak. We know each other, but don't really know who each of us are. She looked forward. I don't know how that makes sense to you. Jason began thinking that this was coincidence of the highest degree. It makes perfect sense to me, he said. Scary perfect. Like, I don't know how this topic is coming up again or what it means. He saw her look at him again, but kept his attention on the cars sharing the road with him. You see, I'm coming from dinner with 3 friends. Well, friends who I don't know much about, but still call friends. Like we have dinner once a month or so, and don't really get tangled in each other's lives beyond that, but we hear what goes on in each other's. She cut him off. Where did you have dinner? She asked, and he did not even mind the interruption. Oh, at the clay pit on 17th, he said. I've been there. Nice place. Very good place, he confirmed. So what 3 friends? She asked. Well, like I said, I don't know much about any of them. But Tabitha is a writer and musician, and she runs some of the open mics around town, usually south of the river. And Danny is a student and barista. She works at Austin Java in Barton Springs. And Carl, who is a comedian and public personality. Carl Nelisser? She asked. Yeah, him. Wow, I've seen him on the local station and heard about his act. He's pretty well known. See, I don't know that because we really don't get into each, she said it with him, others' lives. Yeah, I got that, she said. And I wonder how comfortable conversation in that sort of friendship can be. Surprisingly comfortable, he reported, wishing he had greater inflection in his voice. The distance from each other almost makes the idea of offending each other near impossible, and if it does happen, the apology is easier to give. He thought out loud. Without the super closeness of what we tend to think of as being between friends, it seems easier to be actual friends. She commented while looking at him still. Good thing I wondered. He glanced over to her to see her smile as she looked forward. So I'm sorry for interrupting you, she continued. You were saying something about how some topic had come up while you were at dinner? She prodded his memory. Oh, yeah. He started as he recalled his train of thought. We were talking about how we never really are known by others as being the persons we know ourselves to be. He heard a slight murmur of recognition from her. And somehow we managed to avoid how sad that would make life seem by conjuring the idea that our thoughts, our actions, and our words could be detected by a higher consciousness, a divine entity, or a futuristic amalgam of human and machine that could reach back through time. Same thing when you think about it. She only barely interrupted so as to make comment without detracting from his flow of words. Right? He said in conjunction with her comment before continuing. To see us and read the entirety of our lives as we live it, to then in some way be present with us enough to know us as we know ourselves to truly be. Read us, she asked rhetorically, as though we are characters in a book. A book or many books, he imagined. Like each of us is a book unto ourselves, and the combination of our books with others become different books as well. So this, she started, reader, he gave her the term. Reader, she confirmed the acceptable nature of the term, could know us, in theory, as we truly are beyond what we know ourselves to be. He tilted his head, curious as to this line of thinking that he may have overlooked on his own. I mean, what we know ourselves to be is fettered with similar bias as others have for us, as we also have for them. He quickly looked at her. I mean, I would like to think of myself as the same fluid personality regardless of who I am with, but I am sure the reader would see the subtle and not so subtle differences in my outwardly expressed self, depending on who I am outwardly expressing to. And, she said, realizing as she spoke the thought, the truthfulness of that outward expression, that I'm not just being a phony toward others, but really changing some parts of how I am when with various others. How so? He did not really follow what she had just said, and wondered why, when he could imagine himself speaking in such a voluminous manner. I'm usually thought of as the shy and quiet one in my groups of so-called friends. The reason why I was taking the bus is because I felt too awkward asking one of them for a ride. But I'm in your car and feeling less reserved with you. Maybe it's because I'm usually the socially awkward one too, he said. My friends help me with that, and after my dinner tonight, I decided to try something different, which is when I noticed you. He saw they were nearing the cross street mentioned, and although he did not want this conversation to end, felt that he should at least fathom a conclusion to it, so they would not have an awkward goodbye in a few minutes. I think we may have crossed paths to allow each of us to break further from our usual ways, and I am happy with this drive, if that is the case. He did feel happy, and the sweet pain of noble civility ringing around his own desire. So, Airport Boulevard is coming up. Where do I go? Oh, Lindsay said, it's on the left, and I would like you to come in with me. Yeah, I don't drink. Well, I'm still not sure if I even want to go in there. She looked with care through the windshield as they neared the intersection. I know what will help me decide, she said. There it is. Can you pull in there? She gestured to the bar's small parking lot. Yep. He turned the car and quickly cut across the lanes before the oncoming traffic was dangerously close and rolled into the parking lot. Great, she said, opening the door a little, and then turned back to him. Don't get fully out of the car yet, and maybe don't even shut the engine. She stood up with one foot out of the car, and he mirrored her stance. Hey, Steve, she called to a young-looking, long-haired man standing by the front door of the bar. Hey, he called back while waving, and then gestured to accent each of his next statements. Great to see you. Are you going to see the show? Lindsay looked across the roof of the car at Jason. She spoke loud enough so he could hear her, but not loud enough to be heard across the lot. He wants me there for the show as audience. He doesn't even know my name. Jason didn't say anything, and she squinted her eyes and smiled at him, then turned back to her so-called friend. Nah, I think we're going to get some coffee, but tell Amanda that I stopped by, okay? Okay, the musician replied, his uncertainty clear in his response. But you're gonna miss a great show. It's all right, I'll catch the next one. She motioned to Jason to get in the car, and they both sat, closing the doors as the young musician said something in an attempt to keep the conversation going, but it was something they could not hear at such a distance. She looked at Jason and read his expression. Down airport, there's a coffee shop on the left, near Koenig. I'll tell you when we're getting close. If you drive, I will buy you coffee. Sounds like the best deal I've ever been offered. Jason's voice had more confidence than he had imagined he would ever have heard from himself.